Hello out there, you wonderful people. This is Andre, the Game Idea Guy. Thank you once again for lending me your time and your ear, listening to another Gamer's Thoughts discussion. And this time I'm going to be talking about things from a little bit different of a perspective. Now, I have gone on to say that the seventh generation was kind of cataclysmic for a lot of the middleware studios in the gaming industry. And that it was. I've also talked about how I thought things could be different had seventh generation not focused on pushing HD as much as it did. So, the other thing I want to talk about, and I think that would make a bit of sense if I'm going to attack things in those angles, why not come from the perspective of, maybe this isn't Microsoft and Sony's fault. Bear with me on this. But the Xbox 360 and subsequently the PS3 were products of the desires of third-party developers. Much like the GameCube was, much like the Wii U actually was, even though it got totally ignored. Well, not totally, but mostly ignored. And it's one of those things where I sit down and I'm thinking, if these things were products of what the major third-party developers want, not even going to say developers, but the major third-party publishers wanted, because they were looking for ways to ooh and ah people into purchasing games, which we see is a trend currently, because it never went away after that point. Because everybody's main tactic to get people to purchase their games was to try to, draw them in with higher quality visuals every time that they could. And oftentimes, this was an issue because so much time would be spent on those visuals that a lot of games weren't that great. I'd say honestly, most of the games during the seventh generation were shovelware. Now you definitely had some really good ones, but the majority, I'd say, were shovelware on all three platforms: on the 360, the Wii, and the PS3. And the thing is, people don't talk about the shovelware that was on those platforms, but if you could look at the storefronts on each of them, you would find a boatload of them. Now, a lot of that for Microsoft was in the Xbox Live Indie Games section. Again, not all of them, but a good deal. For PlayStation, a lot of them were sitting on the store, and for Nintendo, many of them were published disc titles, as well as some of the ones that were on the Wii Shop under the WiiWare brand. Again, not all of them, but there were a lot. So for that, to just be sitting down and thinking about that in the long run, if Microsoft and Sony were just working really hard to give third parties what they wanted for the platforms to be able to do the things that they claimed that they wanted to do. Granted, yes, Microsoft and Sony should have had more, I guess you'd say, control over what they were doing. But could you really fault them for trying to make their potential business partners happy and to continue doing business with them, especially knowing that both of those companies, for the Xbox and the PlayStation platforms, they largely depend on third-party development. Even the PS1 depended on a lot of third-party development, even if it was exclusive at the time, but the majority of it was third-party. So, and that still rang true with the PS2. It technically rings true for any console, But it was basically the majority of the third party was the stuff that was top quality for Microsoft and Sony. It wasn't that way for Nintendo. The majority of Nintendo's top quality stuff was first or second party, and it generally stays that way. But there are some really good third party games now now sitting with Nintendo, and even back then there were, but they weren't the games that people would look toward Nintendo's platform to get. And largely, people still, when they purchase a Nintendo platform, look at what Nintendo's games are going to be for them, because that's where they expect the most quality to be. But when it comes down to Microsoft and Sony, many of their best sellers and their highest rated games are third party. Not to say that Sony and Microsoft don't have highly rated first party titles. They do. But there's more far and few in between than it is consistent. And you could say with Nintendo, it's more consistent. So with that in mind, and they know that they're going to need to depend on third party heavily, because again, their games are the ones that are usually the highest rated. I can understand why Microsoft and Sony would bend the knee to third parties, and often. I can understand why they would, especially back then, because that was their best bet. Now, certainly there has been some shuffling around of what companies put what games where, and now we have certain third-party publishers and developers being bought up by different console manufacturers. But that's still something to take into consideration. That would have been one of the major issues that could have caused a lot of this to fall in place. I don't know if a whole lot of people know about this, but the 3DO was actually a console made with third-party developers in mind. That's the funny thing. 3DO was basically developed for third parties to have rank and control over the console. Unfortunately, the 3DO did very poorly for them. And that was something that I remember growing up, because there were multiple iterations of the 3DO, and they couldn't all play all of the games because of different firmware issues among them. They didn't all work the same. There was the Panasonic 3DO, there was Gold Star 3DO, there was another physical version of it, and then there was the disk drive that hooked to your PC that I have yet to ever see in person. So that makes me wonder if maybe when it came down to it, third parties kind of pushed the idea forward. I mean, that's been one of the greater arguments when it comes down to Nintendo's consoles, because they make them so different from everybody. And then people were like, well, why don't they make it more like Microsoft and Sony, so third-party developers would have an easier time to move their games over. Which, true, if Nintendo did make their game consoles more like everyone else's, or let's just say in the instances where they tried to with the GameCube as well as the Wii U, it didn't always work out for them, because they put in the effort to do the things that third-party developers asked for, and then largely got burned. More so with the Wii U than the GameCube. But that's something to think about. Of course, third-party developers and publishers are going to be more heavy-handed on the platform that gives them exactly what they want, as well as being the ones that curtail to them more often. Because I think with Nintendo's case is they kept some independent choices away from third-party developers. They didn't inform them of everything that they were working on, which is their right to do. You don't have to give a business partner every bit of information about what you're working on, especially if you may be just test bedding it to see how well it works. So those are things that I think about. But Microsoft and Sony, they just kind of opened the playbook to them. I'm not saying that that's bad, but if you open the playbook to everybody, that means you don't keep much back for yourself. So it really depends on how your perspective is on that. I mean, I could just be wrong, but it is at least an interesting thing to think about, something to consider. Because I'm not trying to say that this is concrete the reason that we had so many troubles in the gaming industry, especially when it came down to the 7th and the 8th generation, where there was a bit of a recovery towards the middle and end of the 8th generation. But throughout the 7th generation, there were a lot of problems, and a lot of those problems translated over into the 8th generation. Some of them becoming worse well before they got better. So it just, again, it was just an interesting thought process to me. Like, even though 7th generation is the highest and best-selling generation in gaming history, it was laced with a lot of bad practices, a lot of bad games, and bad game design. All for the thought of, oh, that's a pretty game, let me go play that. It's gotta be good if it looks good. Because many trailers made a lot of games much better than what they actually were. And it took a really keen eye in order to spot it. Because a lot of stuff was pushed out like how movie trailers were done. And that was a problem playing movies during that time frame as well. You had a lot of good looking trailers that make a movie seem interesting, but then when you experience it, it was crap. And I've heard that of so many different franchises and IPs, no matter whether it was a movie, a TV show, or a video game during that time period. So maybe the industry got too caught up in, oh, look, it's pretty. Let's make it pretty, versus I just want to make a really good game that runs stably and plays well. And yeah, that expense did kick up and cost a lot of middleware studios the ability to make games. Because so many of them got wiped out or bought up by someone else. And many of them were independent to themselves. Like, they didn't need a bigger publisher. Which also became a problem, because if you went to a bigger publisher and you needed to borrow money from them, you at that point become indebted to them. And that means, hey, if your game doesn't do well, you are in the hole on that project that you worked on. So, and I mostly would say that this was an issue created by the bigger third parties. Because again, 3DO was an attempt at that before. And 3DO was just not successful in any way, shape, or form. I mean, it proved an interesting concept, but it just never went anywhere beyond maybe a few 100,000 sales, as far as I remember. And again, the issue of not every 3DO being able to play every 3DO game was a major problem. Which would mean for you to be 100% certain that you could play every game in the library of the 3DO, you would have to have multiple versions of that console and switch between them as needed. Now, we can definitely say that didn't happen with the PS3 and Xbox 360 because any iteration change for those were all still running basically the same hardware and firmware. They're just improved upon. But we're kind of looking at a similar situation when it comes down to the Xbox One line, the PS4, as well as the Series line and the PS5. So I think largely the PS5 is just the difference of having the disk drive or not. Whereas the Series S and X are different somewhat. I like it is quite a bit different from just a minor drive being missing. The storage is lesser on the Series S, and I think the RAM is lower as well. So again, it's just a multitude of things to think about. And I don't know if this is sustainable to keep doing. Whereas Nintendo, where they gave you multiple different versions of the Switch, they all still kind of largely stick to, hey, this PS2 is the same as that PS2, it's just a different form factor. Or this PS3 is the same as that PS3, it's the same as that PS3, just a different form factor. So, I mean, again, just stuff to think about. And yes, I know the PS3 changed based on taking out the PS2 parts, which made them cheaper to produce and was a boon to the market for Sony. That's how they ended up catching up when they were in the hole. Nintendo quite doesn't need that reason to do what they did. They just gave people different ways to enjoy and experience the exact same thing. But that could be one of the reasons there was so much beef between third parties and Nintendo. Because one wanted things run their way and the other wanted things run their way. That's quite clearly the reason why Nintendo and Sony didn't work out with the disk drive for the SNES. Because they each wanted control over it. And there was no way in the world Nintendo was just going to give them full control. That just wasn't pertinent to them business-wise. So, I don't know. I've pulled a bunch of different factors that I know about just to kind of give some examples that I think kind of would support this. I mean, if anyone else has anything that they would like to add, or maybe even a disagreement that might shed some light on another way that things could have went that I'm not thinking about along this process line, feel free to share it. I am not closed off to discussion. I'm just trying to come up with an idea of what caused us to have that dramatic fall even while the gaming industry was on a financial rise. Because it is an interesting concept. It is something interesting to think about. But for now, I am done. Thank you guys for listening again. Keep your eyes and ears out for more stuff from me. And until the next time, please enjoy your games. Peace out, everybody.